Thank you. I hope Halcom is not in the crowd because lawyers are actively firing off memos. So I stayed up all night last night and I actually changed my topic. I hope that's okay. I'm going to be talking about progressive web apps. Not really. I don't know where Patrick is, but I was kind of trying to induce a heart attack for him.
It was very funny.
Thank you. So I'm Mike Taylor. I live in Austin, Texas. I lead the web compatibility team at Mozilla, which I guess means I'm a manager, which is, I guess we'll do therapy afterwards if anyone wants to commiserate. I also have a blog, which is pretty great. I designed it myself. I'm available for freelance design opportunities here in the Netherlands. I work on a website, so part of what our team does at Mozilla, we have this site called webcompat.com, where we're trying to create like a honeypot for broken web pages. And we're trying to understand like why things are broken. Is this a bug in Chrome? Is it a bug in Firefox? Is this like a platform deficiency? Like the people are using things on the web that we don't know about and need to spec. And as a result of that, sometimes I work on this spec through the WHAT working group called the compatibility standard, which needs more work. So if anyone wants to get into spec writing, you should come talk to me. Anyways, so if you pull out your cardboard viewer, no one actually did. I was hoping someone would be like, this is supposed to be in 3D. Thank you. Yeah, I Googled right before. I said Dutch humor. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't a 404. Seems like people get jokes, which is great. So I'm going to be talking about weird browser APIs, and let's start off with like why I care. Like Mike Taylor, why do I care about weird APIs? So, like I mentioned, I'm interested in browser interoperability. I want things to work the same in all browsers. Ada Rose said test things in Samsung. I think you should do that. Absolutely, you should test them in all browsers that you have access to. There's limits to that insanity, right? But within reason, you should be doing that. As a result, right, like I'm also interested in web platform predictability. This is a term that I think Google invented. Rick Byers over there created a team called the Web Platform Predictability Team. But the idea is the platform should be predictable. You should be able to write code and it should work the same everywhere. You should be able to reason about this and not have all these weird gotchas and historical problems and non-standard things that you rely on. It's a long-term plan. And so this related concept of web compatibility, it's related to interop, but this is more just like your website should work in your browser rather than it should work across browsers. It's a subtle distinction, but it's probably not even meaningful. So raise your hand if you work on a browser. Okay, so for the people who are live streaming, like 400 people raised their hands. But actually it was like 8. So raise your hand if you work on a website or application. Okay, that's nearly everyone. I didn't raise my hand because I'm a manager. Okay, so if you're sitting there asking yourself, like, what? I don't work on a browser. Like, why do I care? We're gonna circle back to this, and hopefully I can make an argument for why you should care. And if I fail, whatever, my talk's over. Okay, so a big hunk of this talk is based on this really great document that the W3C tag, that's the technical architecture group, that they've authored. Dominic DeNicola wrote a lot of this, but I don't think he wants to take credit for it because it's a lot of ideas from people in that group. But you can, if you Google or DuckDuckGo or whatever, W3C tag design principles, you'll get this document, and it's really great. It's a great read, even if you're not designing browsers. So I'm going to steal a little bit of that from him, and I hope he's okay with that. So we're going to go through like 4 or 5 of these kind of like weirdness categories and look at what we have on the web. So side effects. This This is also an educational talk. Don't do a lot of cocaine. Okay, so in the world of programming, observable side effects, right? So if you've ever done any kind of like functional programming or you've heard people talk about it, it's this highfalutin concept which is really simple. Basically, like write a function that returns a value and that's all it does, right? You shouldn't be messing with the outer universe, right? When I call some method, I shouldn't be changing global scope. I shouldn't be changing state that's not in my like local lexical context for JavaScript, for example. Yeah, you should just like return a thing and it should always return that thing. It's like math or something. So on the web, that's mostly true. There are a few examples where this is totally not true. showModalDialog is an example where this is totally violated. Has anyone ever used this API? Okay, so you're showing your age. These people were born before 1998. Everyone else after, presumably. So this is something that IE4 actually invented. So pretty legit API. There's also showModalDialog. I have no idea what that does, but I was going through my DHTML reference and it was next to it. So the idea here on line 2, so showModalDialog, you pass it some arguments. You're going to pass it a reference to another HTML page, and it's going to open that as a dialog. And you can pass it some arguments and some options. Those aren't super important. But the idea is you pause the universe until it returns. So this line 3, like if you were writing this code and if that was just regular JS code, you would expect lines 2 and 3 to execute sequentially, like immediately, right? You wouldn't even know the return value. You wouldn't know what var ret was. But in showModalDialog, you pause the universe and you wait for it to return before you continue. So you're actually halting JavaScript execution. This is weird, right? And so if you've passed in some args and you're in b.html, this dialog, you can access those through this global property window.dialog arguments, which should feel weird to you. And then if you want to return something back, you have to assign a value to window.returnValue. Like this should all feel like the Twilight Zone, right? These are not common patterns we follow anymore, right? So we're pausing execution of JavaScript, which is not easy to do, and it turns out is problematic for a number of reasons. And then we're just like storing a bunch of crap on the global. So some Belgian kid wrote an article about trying to remove this. So there's a really great, I'm not sure if I had a slide in here. Here we go, yeah. So here's a great comment from Adam Barth over the V8, presumably people, Chrome people. They had discovered there's multiple security vulnerabilities that are involved when you pause JavaScript execution, well, specifically in the case of showModalDialog. If you're interested in that, you can come find me and I can send you bug links. It's really interesting, but basically, oh, now I'm remembering, right? So the other thing showModalDialog did was it would spin the event loop. And so if you look in some old Firefox test code, as one does, people were using that as a hack to just spin the event loop. Like, oh, I'll just call showModalDialog without doing anything. We spin the event loop and we can move on with whatever we're trying to test. And so you're storing context, and so you're pushing that up onto the stack, and you can basically like pollute the whole world through that. And so Chrome said, yeah, we got to get rid of this. It's not safe. Usage was pretty high, but luckily usage is like 0 effectively. So if you go home and use this, it's not going to work because it doesn't work in Chrome. IE, I think, still has it, but Edge removed it. Firefox, we accidentally broke this when we were moving to E10S. That's our electrolysis multiprocess world. But we decided, why should we fix that, right? And so this works nowhere, and effectively nothing depends on it. There's a version of Outlook web application, the Mail app, version 2010. You can't upload images anymore, so sorry about that. Arguably, you should. It's like 2017. Okay, so that's weird, but it's dead. This is my cue to drink some water. So Another thing that's weird but not dead is document open. So in terms of like not affecting the universe around you when you call a method. So if you're not familiar with document.open, this gets called for you when you call document.write. So you can open a document through this. If you call document.open, it'll actually call window.open. But inside document.write, it'll call document open. And so let's imagine a scenario where you have this script, global.js, right? And so you've got this method, global thing. It doesn't really matter what it does. And so you've loaded that in your app, and then you're going to document write some code, probably add code, because that's the best way to do it. So I've been told by ad agencies. And then you're going to try to call global thing again, right? Your add code, your tracking code is loaded, and now you want to go. So in some browsers, you'll get this type error. And so I'm going to show you this really hot demo. And we're going to zoom it in. So this is a web page that has zepto.js loaded. It's like a throwback to Zepto. Remember that? OK, so I'm going to load this. OK, so basically what I did was I did document.write, and I tried to call a Zepto function, but you can see Zepto doesn't exist. So that's odd. Let's look at Chrome. Sorry, these are so tiny. OK, suspense. All right. So Zepto exists. We document.writed. I don't know how to conjugate that. We wrote over the entire new document, right? Like if we view source, there's no Zepto in there, right? So that's funky. So like all things, you should go to google.com and type in what working group HTML, and then multi-page, and then you go to the spec, and we try to figure out what's happening in document.open. So step 16 of this algorithm, we don't need to understand all of it, but that last line that's not covered in red says, let realm execution context be the created JavaScript execution context. So what that means is when you're doing document.open, according to the spec, you're supposed to replace the JavaScript global. So you're supposed to get a whole new window object with a whole slew of new junk. And then, of course, the red box means like, that's not actually the way it works. So in WebKit and Blink, you hold on to a reference to all that junk that was on the global. That's kind of weird. So Anna, he said it pretty well. He says, people are arguing like, okay, should Gecko keep following the spec? Should we change the spec? Is what Chrome does the right thing to do? Anna says, like, either way, it's super weird. Just like, don't use it. So that's like the one takeaway you learned. Stop using document.open. OK. So let's look at deterministic APIs. Like, your API should be deterministic. So this is not an example of what I'm talking about. Like, that's expected behavior. So determinism is it should return like the same thing all the time. So I'm going to kind of cheat and lie my way through determinism, and we're gonna expand its definition to include across browser, since as developers, usually we're worried about how things look and work in multiple browsers, or we should be, unless we're doing kiosk work or something else, right? Okay, so this should be, like, if you've written code for the past couple of years, this problem should be somewhat familiar. Like, you're trying to get the scroll top, maybe you're trying to set it to control where scroll is, or understand like where things are overflowing in the viewport. And you have to figure out which one is the right one to do, right? Like, do I get scroll top on the HTML element or the body element? I forget. So most code looks like this, right? Because it turns out it's different. And the reason it's different is the CSS object model spec has a clause in there for compatibility with really old content. Does anyone remember quirks mode, not the blog? Some people remember, right? So that's when you don't have a doc type, and so your parser and layout engine have to kind of like do that. That's what happens inside. And so you can see as a result. So let's just look at some Clojure code. Like, this is this is solid code. We're not making fun of this at all. That wasn't sarcastic, by the way. Like, this is what you have to do, right? So if you're in a WebKit-based browser and you're not in quirks mode, you need to return the HTML element. Sorry, if you're not in WebKit, I screwed that up. Logic's really hard. Otherwise, you should return document body, and the reason is because Safari had it backwards, basically, or they always return document body. It didn't matter if you're in quirks or non-quirks mode, standards mode. So, like when browsers are that inconsistent, really like the only thing you can do is user agent sniffing, right? Like there's no really good feature detection. Like it's possible. I think Matthias maybe wrote a script. Other people have tried. But it's expensive, right? You have to like perform layout and do all these computations. And so the Google folks, the platform predictability folks, are trying to solve this problem. They said, we want to follow the spec and do the right thing, but it just breaks too much stuff. Even Apple, they tried to follow the spec, but like within 5 minutes, someone reported that Facebook is broken. If you work in a browser and you break Facebook, you're going to have a bad time. So Google invented this thing called the scrolling element, and this is basically, it just does what you were supposed to do before. We can look at the implementation of scrolling element in Gecko. This is C++, but it's really easy to understand. You can ignore most of it, but you can see if we're in quirks mode, right, return the body element. Otherwise, return the root element, which is HTML, right? So that's what scrolling element is. It does that logic for you, and so from now on, you don't have to figure out like which one do I use. You just always use scrolling element, and it'll return the right thing. Of course, this is like perfect world scenario where you don't have older browsers, and so you do have to you have to do feature detection and then do the old crap anyways. But this is a path forward to determinism in the platform. Okay, so this is my favorite part: consistent casing rules. So this is a little bit like style. But it has bigger consequences than just style. Raise your hand if you work on a team and you all have a agreed upon style guide. You say, when we name methods, we write them like this. When we name variables, we write them like this. Okay. Interesting. We got like a different group of people raising their hands. Raise your hand if you hate that. All right. I kind of hate it, but I do it anyways, right? Like you do this because it makes the world a better place. So there are conventions that the web platform follow or should follow. So if we're naming a method, we should use camel case, right? That means lowercase to start, then the camel hump somewhere there in the middle. We should use Pascal case for mixins and classes, initialisms, etc. Repeated initialisms are really great. So like the HTML HR element and the RTCD TMF sender. Is everyone familiar with this? I think PPK covered this in his talk last year, right? So I don't need to rehash because he already taught it. I'm just teasing. So that's the real-time communication dual-tone multi-frequency sender, right? So it has nothing to do with my talk. It's just kind of fun to say. What that does, though, when you're using WebRTC, that allows you to do, like, send the tones. You ever have an old modem that would, like, boop? Those tones are still needed for certain, like, phone conference systems, and so there's APIs built to do that, which is pretty great. Anyway, so back to the weird stuff, right? So we don't always, historically, we haven't followed these recommendations. So if you look at XML HTTP request, we call this XHR because it's really annoying to say, but you're like, okay, who has ever typed in HTTP in uppercase? I have. You all have. Like, don't even raise your hand. Or you just type like jQuery.get, and your life was so much nicer. That's usually what I do. So HTML element, so, right, that one. Vendor prefixes, though, like, it gets weird. Okay, so I'm going to give you, like, 10 seconds. This is some code from a test in the Chromium codebase right now. And so you have to try to spot the bug. Sorry. Okay, so I'm hearing some lowercase s, uppercase s. You're both right. So it doesn't, it kind of doesn't matter because the bottom one works in Chrome, and so it fits their needs, fulfills their needs, right? Well, I should probably open a bug later because let's look at what the spec says, right? So we've got this partial interface element with a request full screen method, and then let's go back and look. Like, one of these things is not like the other. Okay, so fingers crossed one day we're going to unprefix WebKit request full screen, and this code will break. So that's awkward. This is a problem, and it's not really. Let's go back and look at this. It's not Chrome's fault. So just so we're clear, like the evolution of the Fullscreen API is interesting historically, right? We had like a Chrome proposal, then we had a Mozilla proposal, and they were kind of close, and then we merged those together and had the What Working Group proposal, and it's much nicer, but there's some problems because no one can unprefix it. Like, no one has actually shipped this unprefix because the whole world falls apart. People did what they did in the very first line. Like, they used this analogy. Like, if you've ever written CSS, which maybe you have since you're here at CSS Day, you know that like when you're doing your like slew of prefixes, you just slap off the prefix and put the unprefixed one, and you're like, oh, I'm future-proofing this. That's what this person did when they wrote this code. They just didn't know the future was going to change. So that sucks. Let's look at my second favorite object model, the CSS object model. So when you're doing a getter, well, you're getting a getter, setting a setter. These are CSS properties. You're familiar with that. You can't do like element.style font-size like it's a bare keyword. That won't work. And so there's rules to convert these to getters that will work. And so I guess this is like almost as cool as VR headsets. These are algorithm hats. Put them on if you got them. So we're gonna read an algorithm in a second. But let's learn about the camel case attribute. So let's learn how do we get font-size into something we can stick in a script and have the browser do the right thing. And so reading in the CSS object model spec, it says, on getting, you have to return the result of this get property value with the argument being the result of running the IDL attribute to CSS property algorithm. Okay, so we're gonna learn the IDL attribute to CSS property algorithm. And this is like, reading specs is hard, reading algorithms is hard. Is anyone here not a native English speaker? Okay, like a couple of you. It's even harder, right? So we're not going to go line by line. We're going to do this. I converted this to JavaScript this morning during somebody's talk. So we all speak the universal language, right? So this algorithm takes a property, right, which is the thing we want to convert, and it's got an empty string called output, some kind of flag, uppercase next. If you pass in the lowercase flag, which we're not doing in this instance, you remember we're just calling the algorithm, no mention of flags. If you pass that in, you remove the first character, right? Thing, character, I think that's what we call those. And then you're going to loop through the rest of that string, right? So we're saying if you run into a dash, that's what that 0x002d is, that's a dash. Raise your hand if you knew that. Okay, spec writers, cool. If you see that, you flip this flag uppercase next to true, right? And then you're done. You restart the algorithm. And then if you found it, you set it back to undefined. I guess you would have maybe done false. It doesn't quite matter. And then you uppercase that next letter. Otherwise, you just return the string. Okay. So that was pretty painful to look at. Luckily, the browser does this for you. And so you get font-size returns font size. Like, and if you don't believe me, we can run this function, because nobody believes me. I think we can open DevTools and view source. That's pretty cool. Okay, so we're going to run this function. I'm a manager. Okay. So we're going to run CSS prop to IDL, font-size. We already know what the answer is, right? It's font size. Hold your applause. You can applaud, I don't care. Right, so this will work for anything, like lol what, right? So this is the algorithm. If only life were so simple. Okay, so let's look at Moz transform, right? So this is a vendor prefix CSS property. It's the same exact algorithm. Oops, I didn't copy the part. I think I screwed something up. Here we go. Oh yeah, deleted something. Anyways, you're supposed to run the algorithm with the lowercase first flag set. And so what that means, you remember from the code, if the first case flag is set, you remove that very first thing. So that means kill the dash, then you're going to uppercase it, and then you're going to keep going. Next time you see the dash, you uppercase it. And that's why we get uppercase Moz transform. Same for WebKit transform. But it turns out that's not sufficient to make the internet work. We had to add this other thing called the WebKit cased attribute, which is similar, but you set the lowercase first flag. And what that'll get you is lowercase WebKit transform. So why do we need to do that? And the reason is there is sufficient content. So this is like super hard to read. I'll explain it to you. There's a ton of content on the internet that is using this map library, leaflet.js, and they forked from some other open map library that weather.com uses, etc. So like tons of maps. And what happened was when the Android native browser, when it unprefixed the transform property, it forgot to unprefix the DOM event. Like understandably, there's a lot of moving pieces, bugs happen. And so people reported bugs to this library like, hey, I can't pan my maps in Android, and that's a problem. And so they figured out, oh, I know what we have to do. We have to detect lowercase WebKit transition before we detect unprefixed transition. And so basically you baked into the web platform, if you support WebKit prefix CSS, you have to support this lowercase WebKit thing, because even though the spec said to do uppercase WebKit, I don't know what happened over at Apple. You need to support the little one. Okay, so just as an aside, I don't know if everybody knows this, but at this point, all the major browsers support WebKit prefix CSS, so you have to support it. And you can boo and hiss, and that's totally okay. Yeah. Hiss. Okay. So let's look at the dashed attribute just for funsies, right? This isn't really a casing thing, but this is kind of weird. So you don't even run an algorithm. It says the dashed attribute on getting must return the result of invoking this get property value, with the argument being just the dashed property attribute. So when I said you weren't allowed to pass in element.style font-size, I was kind of lying. Like you couldn't as a bare like keyword, but you can as a string. And that's kind of weird, and all browsers support that because Google Maps made us do it. So mapping libraries are to blame for a lot of what's wrong on the web, I guess. Okay, so Boolean traps. This is, I don't know if Arya invented this term, but it's really great. So if you Google this article, Boolean traps, it's fantastic. You should read it. If you're ever designing an API, you should keep this in mind. So here's some sweet code from GitHub. So we're doing like a synthetic mouse event. This is a generic case. So you give it the element you want to dispatch that to, and you pass in the type, so maybe click or mouse down or whatever, and then you init that event. You create the event, then you init the event, and then you return and dispatch it. Okay, so this is what this looks like. If anyone can tell me this, I will buy you dinner. No? Okay. It's the meta key, obviously, right? Okay, so maybe you should think about why Booleans as arguments to your APIs are a bad idea. they're really hard to remember, right? Some of these take integers, some of them take Boolean, some of them take references to elements. Nobody has ever used this without looking it up. It's gross. And so one of the solutions is constructors, right? Like constructor function, that's one solution to this problem. The other solution to that problem is the dictionary parameters object thingy. So this is really the pattern you want to be following. And what's great is if you default things to false, if I really just wanted to dispatch a click event with the meta key pressed, which is like command or something on this MacBook, and button 0, which means the left button, if that's all I'm interested in, and I don't care about coordinates or whatever, like this is all I need to do because the rest defaults to false, and it works, and it's wonderful. So if you're forgetful like I am, this is what you want to be into. Stringy APIs. So this is not part of Dominic's document, but this is just kind of my musing here. So strings are interesting because they're useful and they're everywhere. And if you think about it, like your whole job as a web developer is to like put strings together. That's all you do. So you put strings into a web page and then a server downloads them. Like it's not very, like you can do it in cool ways, but all you're doing is putting strings together. So yeah, that was like an existential crisis moment for me. It's like, who gives a shit about functional programming? Like, let's use the plus sign. Anyways, so here's some old APIs, right? Is that command? This was an API that you still can use. Like, there's replacements in Works, editing APIs, but if you ever wanted to make like a rich text editor because you loved pain and suffering, you would use these commands, and you basically just pass it in like this string, and it's similar to like the Boolean trap. You have to know the exact string. You have to keep this reference of strings in your head. So for some reason, for me, like calling a method select all is so much easier than passing in the string select all. It might be because I can't type and my text editor will autocomplete that for me. So here's another example of why strings can be problematic. This one's a bit of a stretch, but the document implementation, DOM implementation, has feature API. This was an early effort to kind of make it possible for feature detection, right? Like this was Modernizer 0.0. I never read this semantic versioning document, but so the idea here was, hey, browser, do you support this thing? And then if it says yes, you're like, cool, I'll do that thing. So this, if you open up your browser right now and you type in, do you support Core 2.0, it'll say true. Like I promise you, it'll say true. And what is Core? That's like DOM Core 2. Nobody knows what that is. Similar to, there's a web page called HTML5 test. I'm sure you all have heard of it, and it does a bunch of feature detection, and it looks for interfaces being exposed and some methods. There was a time when certain browsers started cheating, it's hilarious when you think about it, right? So they started exposing APIs that did nothing so they could get a higher score, so their press releases would be more amazing. None of these browsers are the ones you're using. Like these are kind of niche browsers. So they started lying, right? So same thing happened with has feature, right? So you can guess, like if you say, do you support lol 14? It'll say true, right? So strings, not so great. And here's the actual implementation of has feature in Gecko. You don't have to understand anything other than return true. And the reason that happened was precisely why. Like it wasn't implemented as return true, but that's what it looks like today, and it does the same in Chrome. So here, if you go to the DOM spec, it has a nice little comment. It's useless. It always returns true. So this is a little bit like technical debt, right? You write APIs that you can't get rid of because you ship third-party code, for example, and you can't control when those people are updating your version of my cool library, right? Like you shipped version 3, which deprecated and got rid of all the bad stuff that you learned about, but everyone's still using 1.2. So you can't really kill it. You have to support it forever. This is another string-based API that's pretty fun. So we're going to do, I'm going to switch over to this other slide deck, an incredibly brief historical tour of user agent strings. If you're not familiar what the user agent string is, this is perhaps hard to read, but when you make an HTTP request, the browser always, by default, sends this header, right? A header is just a key pair value. Screw it up. All right, beards are the worst. Okay, so key pair value, you're sending along the string, and the idea there is you're identifying to the server who you are. And so that always happens. Okay, so this was Mozilla 1, right? I don't know if it was called like Thunder, Firebird, what was it called? Phoenix? Nobody remembers, right? This is before anyone was born. I think AOL owned this at the time. Okay, so you might have used this browser. This was IE2. Did anyone ever use IE2? That's impressive. I never used IE2. I think I got on the internet like when IE5 came out. Okay, so this is Firefox 1. I never used this. I was using IE5 or 6 at the time, and my buddy said like, hey, check out this browser called Firefox. And I wasn't convinced. 1.5 had me. Okay. Does anyone know what that is? Conqueror? Yeah, I think it is, right? So KHTML is an open source, maybe it was, I don't know if it's still active, browser engine developed by Trolltech. Interesting tidbit, Trolltech and Opera shared the same floor of an office in Oslo, Norway. So you have a whole lot of early internet engineering in Norway. So what's remarkable about Conqueror? So why does it say Mozilla 5.0? Because it's not. And why does it say like Gecko? And the reason why is the same for IE2 is like, hey, we're Mozilla 1.2.2 compatible. So people started going to websites, important websites like banks. It's always banks and maps. As soon as they break, you start cheating and doing hacks. So they go to websites and they'd get these alerts saying like, oh, this site's optimized for Gecko 5.0, Mozilla 5.0, and so you lie a little bit. And this has never really changed, right? So Safari forked Conqueror, or KHTML, made it WebKit, and so they're keeping in all these like historical tokens. Like they still have somehow a connection to Mozilla. Here's IE8, which is interesting that they were Mozilla 4.0 compatible there. This is Chrome, a super early version of Chrome. And this is Edge, right? This is like, what's that Japanese game that just keeps rolling and getting bigger? That's the one. Katamari Damacy. Yeah, so these are user agent strings, okay? So when you're sending out strings with complicated bits of information like that, like stuff's gonna break, right? So here's something. Let's take a second to look at this code, and I'll tell you a story about Opera 10, which is true for every major browser when it hit 10. Okay, so if you're not familiar with like DHTML JavaScript, no one's used with statements in 15 years. So you're passing in this navigator object, and that kind of like broadens the scope you're in. And so you're saying navigator.appName is the browser, version equals navigator.appVersion char at 0. So back when this code was written, browsers were released like once every 3 years, right? So we got like IE6, that was a huge deal. Like 10 years later, we got IE7. That was awesome. No one ever imagined a browser hitting 10. Like there was no double-digit browser. Like that was not possible. Things, changed and are moving along significantly faster. Chrome just hit 60, I think, Firefox 54 just came out. So the bug on line 3 is this code is saying, eventually there's some other code, but basically it's saying like, if the browser version is less than 3 or something like that, then don't work. And so you're using IE 10 or Presto, Opera Presto 10, and suddenly it thinks you're using version 1, and so nothing works. And so let's see if we can get this big enough. If you look at the user agent, actually this will be easier if we go here, echo.operacom. I hope the Chinese owners of Opera never shut this down. This is the best website on the internet. So it's just echoing back its response. So if you look at the user agent string, it says Opera 9.80. Just kidding. Look at the very end. Is actually version 12.6. And so at that point, the solution to that problem is like, we're always version 9. Right? So these are string-based APIs. Okay. So hopefully you've had some thoughts about why this might be important to you. If you're writing code in a shared environment, whether or not it's like third-party API code, or if it's just code between you and your team, like if you don't write weird APIs, things will be more predictable. Like you don't have to constantly be looking at docs. In theory, less bugs, but there's always bugs. Just different kinds of bugs, right? You're not doing like the dumb bugs. You can write interesting bugs. And in theory, less technical debt, right? Like all the weird APIs I showed you with the exception of showModalDialog, those are in browsers and they will be forever. It's very rare that we get to remove something from the web platform. I screwed that up. Anyways, so thanks.
Oh, you decided to go for that one, huh?
Yeah.
That was my seat.
It's a power move.
Let me see what this is. Oh, no. He's throwing this around on me. So you ran into some weird bugs when you're doing your web compatibility work, I guess. What's the hardest to debug issue that you've run into?
The hardest to debug. So typically, like anytime you're in a Google application, like Gmail or Google Docs, those are really hard. The hardest is spreadsheets because you're not actually editing text. I don't know if people know that. Like it's all canvas-based. And so I've had to try to debug like why the cursor moved, and you end up like, what's the expression? Monkey patching? Duck punching? What is it?
Yeah, duck typing. Duck typing, I guess? Yeah.
It involves an animal and violence. Basically, like any call to any canvas thing, like log out the values. Like you can't use your debugger. You can't use DevTools for that kind of stuff. And so that's, and then you go back to Google and you're like, oh, hey, on line 40,000, B should be false. Can you fix it?
In the minified code.
Yeah, and they usually do, so.
Oh, that's good news.
Yeah.
At least that's something. Did it happen before that you like spent hours debugging some issue on a website, like that Firefox maybe had, and then you reached out to them telling them, hey, if you just add this one line of CSS or JavaScript, it will be fixed and it will work the same way in all existing browsers, but it will also work in Firefox. And people still refuse to implement that?
So that was normally true when I worked at Opera, because nobody knew what Opera was, at least in the US. I'm sure everyone's enlightened here in Amsterdam.
What's Opera?
Yeah. So, people, it's kind of like a chicken and egg situation, right? People go, they look at their server logs, and they're like, well, we don't have any website traffic from your browser. We're not going to actually fix it. And you have to think, like, you might not have traffic because it's so broken that people have to open another browser, and so it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Typically, though, like people recognize Firefox, and so the hardest part is figuring out who to talk to. There's definitely like dark web, like not like where you buy drugs, but like agencies make websites, and it's impossible to know who to talk to get things fixed. Yeah.
So this dark web that you're talking about, I guess LinkedIn could help with that.
Yes.
Just reach out to the CTO of this company and then.
Yeah.
Right, that makes sense. Actually, you mentioned the document.implementation has feature thing. I believe that is being used in some feature tests because it, as if I remember correctly, I think it acts as a weak inference for SVG support in images. So it just happens to correspond with if the browser supports IMG, SRC, and then an SVG image, they will also implement this.
Yeah, I can see how that makes sense. Like if your browser, if it has that interface at all, it's existed past the point when that was a feature that was supported by everyone. So
yeah, that's how I've seen people lose it. It's really crazy because it has nothing to do with SVG by itself.
no.
So in a way, this was the predecessor to CSS.supports or @supports in CSS itself.
Exactly. So in CSS, you have this notion of feature queries, but you're not passing it arbitrary strings like you're passing it key property values like actual CSS. And it only works if the browser tells the truth, right? Like as soon as one of the browsers lies, which they might have to because like maybe YouTube forces their hand, you know, you can't break Facebook, you can't break YouTube. But as soon as a browser lies, like that feature is dead, it's useless. So
Right. That makes sense. Well, thanks for this amazing talk. And I think it's time for a break now. Let's see. I forgot what time you're supposed to be back here. I'm sure you can look at your